The mining settlement of Cold Spire sat at the edge of nowhere, a cluster of prefab buildings bolted into the frozen rock of Titan's outer shelf, where the wind never stopped screaming and the sun was just another distant star you could cover with your thumb. Dane Calloway had chosen it precisely because nobody came here unless they had to. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered from years of hauling or equipment, with hands that had been broken and reset twice and a face that looked like it had argued with a few walls and lost. He wasn't unfriendly. He just didn't see much point in conversation when silence did the job fine. His routine was simple. Wake at 0400, run diagnostics on the drilling rigs, eat something from a can, sleep. Repeat. The settlement had 17 other workers at peak season, but it was the deep, quiet months now, and most of them had rotated back to the inner stations. Just Dane, old Perot the supply coordinator who was mostly deaf and didn't mind, and a rotating skeleton crew of 2 or 3 who kept to themselves. It was a good life, if you didn't need much from it. That changed on a Thursday. He heard the ship before he saw it. Not the clean engine hum of a registered freighter, but something rougher. A coughing, stuttering burn that told him whoever was flying it hadn't maintained their thruster couplings in at least 2 years. He stepped outside the habitat module, thermal jacket zipped to his chin, and watched a mid-size hauler drop out of the black sky at an angle that was aggressive even by smuggler standards. It didn't land so much as surrender to the ground about 400 meters from his perimeter fence. Dane stood still for a moment. Then he went inside, picked up his long-range scanner and his utility blade, not a weapon, technically, just a very decisive tool, and walked out toward the wreck. The hauler was a Varith-class cargo ship, older model, the kind used for transporting goods between outer belt stations. Legally, they carried ore, equipment, sometimes livestock. Illegally, and Dane had seen enough of the outer belts to know the difference, they carried other things. The side hatch had blown partially open on impact. He could smell something even through his rebreather. Fuel. Hot metal. And underneath it, something organic and wrong. He pulled the hatch open the rest of the way. The hold was dark. He activated his wrist light. The first thing he saw were the cages. 12 of them, stacked in rows of 3, each one about the size of a large shipping container. Most were empty. 3 had occupants, small, huddled shapes that flinched from his light. Dane had seen a lot of things in 17 years on the outer belt. He had done work he wasn't proud of, made choices he'd revisited on long, sleepless nights. But the sight of those cages hit him somewhere below rational thought, somewhere animal and instinctive. He started opening them. The first 2 contained beings he vaguely recognized. Harathi, a species from the far reach, short and compact, with gray-green skin and wide dark eyes. They were barely conscious. He moved them carefully, wrapping them in the thermal blankets from his pack, speaking low and even in the few words of trade tongue he knew. Safe. You're safe. I won't hurt you. The third cage was harder to open. The lock had warped in the rough landing. He worked at it for 3 full minutes before it gave. Inside was a girl. Not human. Clearly. Her skin had a faint luminescence to it, a very pale blue-white that shifted slightly when she breathed, like moonlight on water. Her hair was silver-white and tangled, stuck to her face. She was slight, wrapped in a thin garment that was completely inadequate for the cold, and she was staring at him with eyes the color of deep ocean, dark, layered, unreadable. She looked about 16 in human terms, though he had learned early not to trust appearances across species. She didn't flinch from his light. She watched him. It's okay, he said, which felt inadequate. I'm going to get you out. She didn't move when the door came open. Just watched him. He held out his hand. Palm up. No weapon. No urgency. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she took it. Her name, as best as he could reconstruct from her own gestures and the partial translation matrix on his scanner, was something like Sierrian. Though she seemed to accept Saya when he used it, the ghost of something crossing her face that might have been tolerance or might have been amusement. The Horathi he helped to the nearest emergency pod and signaled the station relay for a medical transport. They would be picked up within 18 hours, and they were conscious enough now to understand they were safe. Saya was a different matter. She wasn't injured in any obvious way, but she was cold to the point of danger, and something about her physiology made the medical scanner give him readings it clearly hadn't been designed to interpret. He brought her inside, sat her near the thermal unit, and made the closest thing to warm food he could manage, which was, embarrassingly, reconstituted vegetable broth from a packet, and set it in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at him. She picked it up with both hands. She had 4 fingers on each hand. He noticed, the extra one set slightly apart like a secondary thumb, and drank it slowly, watching him over the rim the entire time. "I'm Dane," he said, pointing to himself. She repeated the sound carefully. "Dane. Close enough." He set up the secondary bunk in his module's back room, showed her how the lock worked from the inside, demonstrated it himself so she'd understand it was her choice, and left her to sleep. He sat in the main room for a long time afterward, listening to the wind and thinking about the ship. He went back to it in the early hours, before the light shifted. Whoever had been flying it was dead, single pilot, killed in the crash, and Dane spent exactly no emotional energy on that. He found the manifest, encrypted but not well, and ran it through his cracker tool. The ship's name had been the Verith Moon. The cargo listing described 12 non-registered biological units acquired from, and here the record became deliberately vague, reach-adjacent collection zones. Destination: a private station in the outer Kelvari belt, registered to a holding company that Dane recognized as a front name used by a trafficking network he'd heard called the Pale Chain. He photographed everything, transmitted the manifest to an anonymous relay that would forward it to the nearest regulatory authority for whatever that was worth out here. Then he disabled the ship's transponder so it wouldn't call home. He went back inside and went to sleep. The next morning, Saya was sitting at his table. She had found the small hand-drawn star chart he kept pinned near the window, an old habit from his early navigation days, and she was studying it with an intensity that made him slow his steps to avoid startling her. When she heard him, she looked up. Then she pointed to a region of the chart, the outer reach, the deep cluster beyond the Kelvari belt. "That where you're from?" he asked. She touched the area again. Then she touched her own chest. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." He made coffee, real coffee, one of his few luxuries, and sat across from her. She watched the coffee the way she watched everything, as if she was cataloging it. "You speak any trade tongue?" he asked. She made a gesture with her 4-fingered hand, rocking it side to side. "A little. Maybe. Okay, we'll figure it out." They spent most of that day in a slow, strange conversation, part gesture, part the handful of shared trade words she did have, part Dane drawing things on the small whiteboard he used for equipment calculations. He learned that she had not been alone when she was taken. There had been others from her people, but they had been separated across different ships. He learned that her people were called the Seer, or something phonetically close, and that they lived in a network of habitats in the deep reach. He learned that she was not a child, despite how she looked. In human equivalent terms, she told him through careful gestures and held up fingers, she was closer to 26. He learned that she was watching him the same way he was watching her, carefully, without conclusion, waiting. Days passed. Old Perot, when he finally noticed there was an additional person in the settlement, simply nodded in her direction and said, "New hire." And when Dane said sort of, Perot nodded again and went back to his supply manifests. This was one of the things Dane most appreciated about Perot. Saya's health improved steadily. She ate, cautiously, testing each thing, but consistently. She slept long hours at first, then shorter ones, and started being awake when he came in from his morning rig checks, sitting at the window or the table with the strange stillness her people seemed to carry as a default state. She helped him, without being asked, on the 3rd day. He was recalibrating the external sensor array and the access panel was awkward for one person to manage. She simply appeared at his side, understood the mechanism after watching for about 20 seconds, and held the component exactly where it needed to be held while he worked. When it was done, she looked at what they'd accomplished with a kind of quiet satisfaction that he recognized. "You're useful," he told her. She said something in her own language. Then, in careful trade tongue, "You. Also." He laughed. It surprised him, the actual sound of it, like something that had been stored in a box for a while. She looked at him when he laughed, and her luminescent skin shifted very slightly, just around her collarbone and jaw. He would learn later that this was the Seer equivalent of a smile. On the 8th day, the ship came. It was early morning when the proximity alert went off, not the stuttering crash ship chaos of the Verith Moon, but a clean, deliberate approach. A large vessel, well-maintained, dropping into standard landing approach with practiced efficiency. Dane was at the perimeter with his scanner before they touched down. The ship was a Seer long runner. He recognized the design from the charts now, the particular swept configuration of the engine mounts. It was bigger than anything in the settlement, built for deep travel, and it landed with quiet authority about 200 meters out. The ramp came down. They came out in a group, 12 of them, and then more, 20 in total. All women, he registered, which surprised him only briefly before his brain recalibrated. They were Seer, the same pale luminescence as Saya, the same silver-white hair, the same quality of absolute stillness when they stood. Their ages ranged widely, from what looked like late middle age to young adulthood, and they were dressed in the practical, layered way of people who spent their lives in deep space. They stopped about 30 meters from his perimeter fence. The one at the front, older, with luminescence that had deepened from pale blue to something closer to violet, hair braided back in an elaborate pattern, looked at him steadily. Dane looked back at her. Then a sound from behind him, and Saya came through the habitat door at a pace he had never seen from her, not running exactly, but something faster and more purposeful, and she passed him and went through the gate and covered the distance between them, and then the older woman's arms came around her, and Saya's face went into her shoulder, and both their luminescence shifted at once, brightening, the pale blue becoming briefly brilliant, and it looked like two moons recognizing each other. Dane stood at his fence and watched this and felt something he couldn't immediately name. The older woman looked up at him over Saya's shoulder. Her eyes were very dark, very layered, and they were the most direct eyes he'd ever been looked at by. She studied him for a long moment. Then she said something in Seer. He didn't speak it, but Saya, lifting her face from the older woman's shoulder, turned to look at him. In careful trade tongue, translating, she says, "You kept her safe." "I didn't do much," Dane said. Another exchange. Saya again. She says, "You did not have to do anything." "You did." He nodded, not sure what the right response was. "She's okay. That's what matters." The older woman spoke again, longer this time. Saya listened, and something moved across her face, something more complicated. "What did she say?" Dane asked. Saya looked at him. In trade tongue, slowly, she says, "We have been looking for Saya for 43 days. We did not know if she was alive." She says, "A human man on a frozen rock, alone, opened the cage." A pause. She says, "We do not forget this. The Seer do not forget." They stayed for 3 days. This was not what Dane had expected. He had expected a brief exchange, gratitude, perhaps some negotiation about transport, and then departure. The outer belt ran on efficiency. Instead, the Seer set up a secondary camp adjacent to his settlement with a competence and speed that told him they'd done this kind of field operation many times before. They brought supplies off the long runner and set up equipment he didn't recognize, and they moved around the settlement with the ease of people who treated the whole of space as their home ground. The woman who had embraced Saya was named Veiltheri, commander, or something close to it, though the Seer structure seemed less strictly hierarchical than the word implied. She was the one who had led the search. She was Saya's aunt, he learned, the closest thing Saya had to a surviving parent, and the grief behind that particular piece of information was something Dane did not ask about and Veiltheri did not offer. She came to speak with him on the first evening, and despite the language gap, trade tongue was her fourth language, she indicated, by holding up 4 fingers and looking faintly impatient at the limitation. She was very clear. The pale chain had been operating in the Reach for 11 years. They had taken many people. The regulatory authorities of the inner stations filed reports and did, as far as Veiltheri was concerned, precisely nothing. The Seer had been running their own recovery operations for the last 4 years, since the formal channels had proven themselves decorative. "Your manifest," she said, and he understood she'd seen the transmission he'd sent on the first night. "We received it. That is how we found." She touched her own sternum in what he was beginning to understand was a Seer pronoun for someone close, rather than an I. "Her." "Good," he said. "Use it however it helps." Veiltheri looked at him for a while in her thorough way. "You are alone here," she said. "Not a question." "Mostly. Why?" He considered the question. It deserved a real answer. "Easier," he said finally. She made a sound that might have been the Seer equivalent of him. "This is a sad reason," she said. He didn't argue. Saya spent those 3 days differently than she had spent the previous 8. She was still present. He would look up from his work and find her nearby, that four-fingered hand doing something methodical or her eyes on the star chart. But she moved with a different quality now. Lighter. Less like someone holding their breath. He was glad, and the gladness was clean and uncomplicated. On the second day, she found him working on the rig calibrations again and came to help without discussion, just as she had before. They worked side by side for 2 hours in near silence, and it was the most comfortable 2 hours Dane had spent in longer than he could remember. He said, without thinking about it much, "You don't have to stick around. Your people are here." She looked at him. In trade tongue, slowly, "I know. I choose." He nodded and went back to work. On the second evening, some of the seer women gathered in the area between the two camps, and one of them began to sing. Dane sat on the steps of his habitat module and listened. The seer music was unlike anything he'd heard, multi-layered, each voice adding a thread that was independent but wove into the others, and their luminescence moved in sync with it, slow pulses of light in the dark, like a living constellation. Old Perrault came and sat next to him after a while, watching. "Huh," said Perrault. "Yeah," said Dane. They sat in silence and listened. On the morning of the third day, they prepared to leave. Valtheri shook his hand. She'd learned the human gesture somewhere and deployed it with the formal precision of someone making an agreement, not just a courtesy. She held his hand for a moment after the shake and looked at him and said something in Seer. Saya, standing nearby, translated. She says, "The Seer have long memories. If you need shelter, our door is open across the reach. You say my name, and any ship will know." "Tell her that's a generous offer," Dane said. Saya translated. Valtheri replied. "Saya, she says, it is not generous. It is what is owed." He nodded. He understood the distinction. The crew began boarding. Saya lingered. She stood in front of him, and they looked at each other, and there was a lot in that space. 8 days of slow trust built across a language gap. Two people who had both learned early to be self-sufficient and had spent this time bumping up against the limits of that. She reached into the fold of her outer layer and drew out a small object, flat, disc-shaped, with a faint internal luminescence. She held it out. He took it. "What is this?" he asked. In trade tongue, careful and deliberate, Seer make these. She paused, searching for someone who stayed, when they did not have to. He looked at the disc. The light inside it was slow and steady, like breathing. "I'll keep it," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then, Dane. His name, the way she said it, with that slightly rounded vowel. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Just be okay." Something moved through her luminescence, that same shift around the collarbone and jaw. Then she turned and walked up the ramp. The ramp closed. The long runner left with the quiet efficiency it had arrived with, climbing into the black sky and becoming a point of light, and then becoming nothing. Cold Spire went back to being the frozen rock at the edge of nowhere. Dane stood at the perimeter for a while. The wind was screaming again. His coffee was cold. Somewhere behind him, Perrault was doing inventory and singing tunelessly to himself. He turned the disc over in his hand. The light inside it pulsed, slow and steady. He went inside. He pinned the disc on the wall next to his star chart. He made fresh coffee. He sat down and looked at the chart, the familiar regions of the inner belt, the stations, the transit lanes, and then at the far edge of it, the deep reach cluster that Saya had touched with her four-fingered hand. He sat there for a long time. Then he found a clean sheet and began to write, a proper account of everything he'd found on the Varith moon, everything in the manifest, everything he knew about the Pale Chain's operation in this sector. More thorough than the transmission. The kind of document that, given to the right person, might actually matter. He didn't know exactly who the right person was yet, but he had time to figure it out. Outside, the wind was still screaming. Inside, the disc on the wall glowed steadily, patient and slow, like something that was built to last. Dane Calloway had come to Cold Spire because he didn't need much from his life. He was beginning to revise that assessment. Not in the dramatic, overturning way of stories where a single event rewrites everything and a man emerges transformed and announced. Nothing so loud. Just a quiet shift, the kind that happens when something enters your world that you didn't expect and turns out to be worth more than you knew how to measure. He had opened a cage because it was the obvious thing to do. He was only beginning to understand what that meant. 3 months later, A transmission arrived on the Coldspire relay channel, coded in a frequency he didn't recognize at first, and then did. Brief. Efficient. Sear style. It said, "We found 2 more ships." Manifest was the key. 11 people recovered. V. Dane read it 3 times. He typed back, "Good. What do you need from this end?" The reply came 6 hours later, deep space lag. It said, "We will tell you when we know." Saya. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he started figuring out what the Pale Chain's next likely route through the outer belt would be, and whether a drilling settlement at Coldspire was an inconvenient location for anyone who wanted to run cargo past unnoticed. It was, he decided, an extremely inconvenient location. He was starting to think that was the point.